Have you ever just sat back, stared blankly out a window, and let your mind completely wander? You might assume your brain is just powering down to conserve energy, right? Well, as we're about to see in this explainer, that assumption couldn't be further from the truth. It's a massive paradox that actually puzzled scientists for decades. Why does the brain consume so much energy when we're supposedly doing absolutely nothing? Today, we're going to learn exactly how researchers managed to map the brain's invisible background app. It turns out this is a massive, energy-hungry network that paradoxically only kicks into high gear when you stop paying attention to the outside world. To get our heads around this, we'll break things down into 6 quick parts. We'll start with the accidental brain discovery, define the network, and then, crucially, look at the 3 neuroimaging methods scientists use to identify it: subtraction, deactivation, and connectivity. Finally, we'll wrap up with why this all matters. All right, let's jump into part 1, the accidental brain discovery. So back in the 1970s, a researcher named David Ingvar used an early regional cerebral blood flow scan, basically measuring blood flow using an inhalation technique, and his team stumbled onto something wild. They showed that our brain is vigorously active, specifically in the frontal regions, even when we are simply resting. Ingvar famously proposed that this hyperfrontal pattern reflected spontaneous, undirected conscious thought. Basically, the invisible brain work we do when left completely alone. The crazy part? He was light years ahead of his time, and it literally took decades for modern neuroimaging to fully catch up to him. Which brings us to part 2, defining the DMN, or the default mode network. Here is the absolute core paradox of the whole thing. Unlike your visual or motor systems, which obviously turn on when you look at something complex or move your arm, the DMN operates in reverse. During externally demanding, goal-directed tasks like, say, focusing on a math problem or navigating a really busy street, the DMN actually shuts down. But the second you switch to undirected mental states, the DMN fires right back up. It is a network dedicated almost entirely to internal thoughts, memories, and mental simulations. When mapping this out, scientists find these active regions distributed widely right across the association cortex, its prime real estate. The network heavily features the medial prefrontal cortex up at the front and the posterior cingulate cortex toward the back. And because these regions consistently light up together, it tells us this isn't just one localized spot. It's a vast, highly coordinated system covering a huge amount of the brain. So, how do we actually track this thing down? To make identifying this network incredibly easy to remember, let's use a simple detective's rule of 3. When scientists want to locate the DMN in a brain scanner, they rely on 3 primary methods: subtraction, deactivation, and connectivity. Let's start with part 3, method 1, subtraction. Early imaging studies use really basic experimental control conditions, like just having someone stare at a simple fixation cross or a string of hash marks on a screen. By taking an active cognitive task and mathematically subtracting that baseline rest state, researchers noticed something super strange. They kept spotting regions that were inexplicably highly active right before the active task began. So by looking at what activity was effectively lost when moving from rest to an active task, the default network emerged mathematically. It was the system constantly running in the background. Moving right along to part 4, method 2, deactivation. The exact moment a stimulus requires your external attention, the dynamic changes are instant. If you track the bold fMRI signal, it sharply drops in the default regions, right while sensory areas, like the visual cortex, ramp up. We are quite literally watching the network turn off to reallocate cognitive resources to the outside world. It's exactly like pausing a heavy background download on your computer so your active video stream doesn't buffer. And the really cool thing is the incredible convergence across completely different experimental setups. Whether researchers use blocked design fMRI, where tasks are grouped together in chunks of 20 to 60 seconds, or event-related fMRI, they consistently see these exact same specific regions deactivate. That convergence across completely different methods, that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the DMN is a concrete, anatomically defined brain system. It's not a fluke. Which brings us to part 5, method 3, connectivity. Now, functional connectivity, what does that mean? It simply means that even though these brain regions are physically far apart from one another, their spontaneous activity fluctuates in perfect synchronization. Imagine a really well-rehearsed orchestra. The violins and the cellos are seated on completely opposite sides of the stage, right? But they naturally swell and fade together, playing the exact same melody without even needing a conductor. So, if we plant a mathematical seed in the hippocampus, which is the brain's center for episodic memory, an entire interconnected web of subsystems lights up together. This proves the DMN isn't just one uniform blob. It actually has a medial temporal lobe subsystem feeding us memories, a medial prefrontal subsystem building self-relevant simulations, and they all communicate through central hubs like the posterior cingulate. It's a highly organized machine. And that leads us perfectly into part 6, why the DMN actually matters to us. The clinical relevance here is just staggering, because the DMN relies on our memories to simulate our reality. When it breaks down, the consequences are profound. An overactive DMN is strongly correlated with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, like hallucinations and delusions. In autism, the network often shows disruptive connectivity. And tragically, Alzheimer's disease causes early, accelerated atrophy directly in these specific default mode hubs. But for healthy individuals, this network is the engine behind stimulus-independent thought, which is just the fancy scientific term for mind wandering. By combining those 3 identification methods, subtraction, deactivation, and connectivity, modern neuroscience has mapped the DMN in stunning high resolution. What we see in single individuals is that the DMN is practically acting as our internal life simulator. It's exactly how we remember the past, envision a future, navigate complex social interactions, and construct a cohesive sense of who we are. There's a quote from the research that really hits the nail on the head. It suggests that these task-unrelated thoughts represent the normal default mode of operation for the self-aware. By identifying the DMN, we've quite literally mapped the neurobiology of the wandering mind. Being deeply engaged in internal, task-unrelated dots isn't a glitch in your hardware. It is the fundamental signature of human self-awareness. So the next time you find yourself staring blankly into space, realize that your brain is actually working incredibly hard. Ask yourself, what is your background app simulating right now? Are you reliving an old memory, or maybe planning a future conversation? It really leaves you wondering about the sheer power of doing absolutely nothing, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and hey, keep letting your mind wander.